presentation that I gave earlier, talking about, the future is more decentralized and it's more about blockchain networks replacing existing networks. And one of those networks is the financial network, the venture capital network, that I think over time will be, if not replaced, at least supplemented by more direct peer-to-peer financing. So that's what this is going to be about. We want to be very critical thinking. There's a lot of bad ICOs out there. I've been very vocal against them. There's a few gems, but they're the exceptions. But we're early days. So what we're going to hear from this great panel. Why don't we just go down the line. Gerald, start with you, and then just introduce yourselves. We'll do some questions, but we're also wanting a lot of questions from the audience. So kick it off.
So I'm Gerald Reihsen, corporate securities attorney based out of Dallas. Actually, for the last 20 years, I've been an entrepreneur in both technology and real estate companies. And I'm back to practicing again with my newly law school graduated son, and doing some entrepreneurial things. So it's based in other ways.
My name is Patrick Barron. I'm the head of sales and business development at AmbiSafe, based in San Francisco. We're a full-service ICO provider. We take clients all the way through the process. We help them with PR and marketing. We make introductions to legal, due diligence firms, escrow agents. We also do all the technology, so this includes writing the smart contract. We have a token sales wizard that's powered by our decentralized exchange called orderbook.io. It's an Ethereum token exchange. So Orderbook is both a primary and a secondary market for ICOs. And we also can be retained to do post-ICO development. We have about 100 folks total, a large development shop in Kiev. To date, we've launched about, I think the total is about 15 ICOs. We have one launching every 2 or 3 days on Orderbook between now and the end of the year.
So have you been busy?
We've been busy, including the Proppy ICO, which just successfully raised over $15 million.
We're trying to get Natalia here, but she is too busy. So.
Yeah. AmbiSafe.
AmbiSafe. Louis, well, we know you, but go ahead.
Back again, just quickly on the subject of token sales. We've been one of the leaders in that space and very active online. I think, Ragnar, you've seen you support the positions that you've taken. There are a lot of issues around token sales, a lot of legal issues that I think not everybody has digested. So I'm hopefully here to bring a little bit of sense and sensibility to the topic.
Perfect. Yeah, Hendrik.
Hi, I'm Hendrik, co-founder and CTO of Radar. So what we are trying to introduce is an asset-backed tokens, and basically all the tokens that related to the properties should be backed by the value of the real estate.
Great. So I'll ask some questions real quick though. Before that, we have our room reserved. If you guys want to take a break and want to talk and conversation, it's room 1801, which is, I guess, just outside there, right? Around the corner. So during breaks, if you guys just want to talk, you can go out there and do that. All right, so first question. Patrick, let's start off on a positive note before we throw eggs. Why would a real estate startup want to do a token sale?
That's a good question. So it depends on what type of real estate startup we're talking about. If the startup is looking to create something along the lines of a REIT, then it's a crowdfunding mechanism where you can issue a token. Of course, if there's a security, then you got to follow all the rules and regulations and file with the SEC, do investor accreditation verification, these types of things. If you are looking to launch a real estate startup that will have some form of utility, that is, the token is going to facilitate the transfer and facilitate work on a platform, then it's a fantastic way to do an initial round of funding and to really bring in an entire network. So the beauty of launching a utility token is that you can sell it to people who will be participating and who will be your potential clients, and so you can leverage the network effect. It's much more pleasant than trudging up and down Sand Hill Road. I don't know, I could go on for days, but another huge benefit is that this really opens up a global market to participate in your funding. And this is something that hasn't really been easy to do up until this time. So you really get a global base.
Great. Do you guys ever tell someone not to do one? They come to you and say, hey, we want to use you for our token sale ICO, and you say no?
Absolutely. So we say no much more than we say yes. We're inundated with requests, and so my job, I call it sales, but it's more filtering. It's filtering for the high quality projects and figuring out really what the essence of a project is, whether or not it makes sense to have a token, whether or not this is somebody who has no idea what they're doing. Yes, we do say no quite a bit.
Okay. Jerry, how does real estate ICOs, how does that compare to like, real estate securitization? What are the parallels that you see, if any? None.
So that's actually a tremendous question. So from 2000 through 2012, 2015, I was with the co-founder of Barrington Harvard, and we securitized real estate in the non-listed REIT and the 1031 type environment. Raised over $5 billion, $12 billion under management our peak. But this whole dynamic is very similar to the original 1031 type syndications, using the tenant common dynamic.
TICs.
Yeah, and so for the purposes of real estate law and tax law, you would syndicate out tenant in common interest, and they would be real estate interests. But for the purposes of securities law, since you had a centralized body taking in the capital, managing the capital, it was the security. So we had to do Reg Ds and whatnot. Now there was one industry player, and we were raising, this space was raising about $2-3 billion of the space, and now it's back to doing that again. It's since morphed to something called Delaware Statutory Trust structure, but that was tenant common. We had one player in the space out of Boise, I think, who raised their capital both in the real estate brokerage community and in the securities brokerage community. And they got a legal opinion from some Utah lawyer that it wasn't a security when they did it through the real estate brokerage community. Well, 2008 hit, and they're the only guys from the crash I know of who went to jail. So I would caution yourself from thinking that, oh, it's a utility, so it's not a security. We don't have to comply.
Great.
I've been there.
Great parallels. So, Louis, going about securitization in real estate, there's some real estate developers who say, hey, I'm going to ICO my portfolio. Can they do that?
Sure. So I think actually Hendrik made a tremendous point, and you can pick up on that. It's the difference between whether the token is in fact intended to be a security or if it's intended to be a utility coin. As I like to do, I say, hold up a piece of paper and say, well, is this a security? And you look at a blank piece of paper. Exactly my point. A token, likewise, is a vessel that can be structured to be a security, in which case you'd be darn sure that you comply with securities laws, but it can also be structured to be something else. Now, in real estate, I've seen very, very few models that I would say fall into the something else department. We have talked to some folks about some interesting permutations, which I'll save because they're more private. But I think, by and large, for the most part, if you're considering a token sale in real estate, you probably have security. But there may be very good reasons why a tokenized security is more attractive both to an issuer and to an investor than a more traditional one. Particularly, I would say, transparency on the underlying asset and the flow of information, as well as having a one-to-one relationship with your investors, which you wouldn't typically have in a security that was in a clearing system like DTC.
So if a real estate owner developer says, yes, I'm going to do a token sale ICO for my portfolio, they can, but most likely, A, it's a security, so they just follow the securities laws. But you brought up an interesting point, so fill that out a little bit more. So what are the advantages? Why not just, securitize this in a traditional paper manner? Why, other than to get a buzz from, saying that you're doing it?
I like a buzz. But I saw Hendrik, you nodding. Do you want to pick that up? Because I want to give you an opportunity.
Yeah, Hendrik.
Okay, so we've been approached by a lot of people asking to ICO something like buildings, shopping malls, but we are not there yet. We say, what if the technology that we are trying to do is tokenization? And the applications like the crowdfunding, maybe for undeveloped, not developed yet real estate will come later, but at this stage we are not doing that. We are doing the tokenization technology.
And I talked to a couple people in Singapore. They had a slight, I don't know if it was a change in law, but there was something. Could you talk about how you guys have adapted to either the SEC's ruling or anything going out of Singapore? If you guys have had to change your model, or has it stayed the same, or has that affected you guys, good or bad, either way?
Okay, so we as a company, we have legal advisors that keep in touch with all the regulatory. Yeah. So for me, I not in the capacity to talk about the regulatory perspective. Yeah.
Okay, well, George, just on the SEC front, so I'm sure many of you have been following the developments. The first significant public statement made by the SEC was their Section 21A report over the summer on the DAO, a distributed autonomous organization that sold tokens in the summer of 2016, and the SEC's report concluded, to no one's great surprise, that those tokens were indeed securities, they were unregistered, and there were violations of U.S. Federal securities law. Subsequently, there was a complaint filed against an individual who had a platform called Reihsen, in which again there were alleged violations of securities laws. In the latter case, it seems more of a garden variety fraud type structure, because the allegations, were unfortunately very sad that misstatements were made, that no property was purchased when they said it was purchased. And I put that into somewhat of a different bucket, because as you say, hopefully most folks will not be committing outright frauds. But for those of you who want to proceed in a lawful way, it is a very difficult environment right now, and really you should speak to not only lawyers, but lawyers who are actively engaged in this space.
Great. Patrick, you guys did the Pro B ICO. Have you done any other real estate ICOs, or was that your first?
That's the first one.
Okay, do you want to just maybe tell people about them and what they do?
Sure. So Probi is a platform for decentralized title registry, as well as the transfer of assets. And the goal is to really facilitate cross-border transactions, so international investors purchasing domestic real estate. And they recently had the first transaction, which was in Ukraine. So the title was recognized and the funds were transferred in one instance. So got a success, got a win under their belt right there. I have a pet project that I really want to see happen around an ICO, a piece of real estate. So of course, in the United States, title still has to be paper, and it's got to be on file in the county recorder's office or wherever it is. However, the state of Delaware recently legalized blockchain-based shares. So my idea is that, feel free to shoot this down if you see holes in it, is to create a special purpose vehicle and assign the title to this SPV. Now this SPV, you can issue the shares on the blockchain. So you go to the Articles of Incorporation, and the Articles of Incorporation say if you want to see who owns the shares of this company, this SPV, you have to go to this smart contract address. So then the Ethereum network, that smart contract, becomes the cap table management ledger of truth. And so then you can theoretically launch an ICO for ownership in this business, and the business owns this one piece of real estate. And it just so happens that the Ferry building in San Francisco, one of the most iconic buildings, is for sale. Actually, more specifically, the lease for the Ferry building is for sale. And so if I can bring all the pieces together, then I intend to launch an ICO for the Ferry building.
Well, let's analyze that, attorney.
Well, I guess I would say that, look, number one, just like we didn't need cell phones in the United States in the 1980s because we had a very nice phone system, but they added a lot of convenience and productivity, we don't need blockchain to manage real estate ownership and transfer dynamics in the United States, although it might make it more efficient and interesting. I mean, the huge advantage of cell phones was to the third world, and same with blockchain, where they don't have good systems. As far as your concept, look, you can already do that. You just own a building in a corporation, own multiple buildings in a corporation, and you can transfer the shares. That doesn't mean that the blockchain concept might be more efficient, But you don't ever forget that one of the real advantages of the title system is it kind of like the bankruptcy court. You wipe out the operational liabilities of the person who owned it last, right? If you keep it in some kind of underlying trust dynamic, every slip and fall that might be alleged later still is going to be able to be brought against the enterprise that owns it. So you got to, the one issue about blockchain or any other new technology, always ask yourself if you're viewing it from some sort of utopian perspective, because it's a human system. And so how does it compare? Where is it at? It may be very, I love blockchain concepts and tokenized businesses. You have to understand strengths and weaknesses, human fallibilities, and everything else around it.
Great.
Just quickly, I share that view, and as we highlighted, it's really compared to what? So as we noted, so compared to a traditional sale of securities backed by this particular building, what are the value add points of the blockchain? So for example, is lease data or is underlying economic data on that property being provided to token holders, for example, in more rapidly or even in real time? So if you had sensors, if there's retail, for example, might you have sensors that show footfalls that you could see in real time because it's being tracked and conveyed in a blockchain, which would be at a minimum much more difficult to do with a traditional property. So there are a lot of functionalities that can be brought to a token and make that differentiated, but you want to really articulate that it certainly would be a security, and you'd have to, of course, sell them to appropriate purchasers.
Some of the other things that we're looking to do with this as well includes one, using smart contracts to facilitate the leases for the commercial tenants, and in whatever ways we can reduce the paperwork associated with that. Another interesting concept is because this is a commercial property and it generates revenue. Another company that we did an ICO for called Task Fund recently made history in that they became the first company to issue a dividend through a smart contract. So they had they're a closed-end hedge fund. They made some profit in Ether and they distributed the profit through a smart contract directly to the token holders' wallets. So the same concept can be done through this technology. Now, of course, yes, you can still mail checks out in the mail, and it's not necessarily game-changing or paradigm-shifting, but it is more efficient, and I think that it is going to have a much deeper impact, specifically in the real estate industry in developing countries that don't have as much of the good infrastructure that we have here.
So let's talk about people who don't want to they're not entrepreneurs, but they're investors maybe. Let's talk about what is a good team, what's a good ICO, what's a good token sale, what are some signs that yes, this is something that you should put your hard money, your money into versus not. So let's talk about what are some good signs. And I'll let Hendrik or whoever wants to take that. What is like a good?
Okay. Good sign of ICO, I would say a strong, honest team that with the right advisory. So, for example, how we always angle it, we always seek legal opinions on the jurisdiction that we are working with. So just in one point, from the legal side, we don't want anything to collapse, and that will bring down all the values. So I think this, in my opinion, is one of.
And Louis, someone comes to you and says, "Hey, Louis, I'm doing a token sale, and what are you looking for if you're going to put your money into it? What's a good team to invest in?"
Besides a solid retainer.
Yeah.
So it's a great question because there's a critical difference that I think people don't necessarily get their head around because we started really mostly with utility tokens. And so the value of a utility token is very unclear. Often you'll have a reverse Dutch auction or you'll have pricing set in a way that's sort of, how much you want to pay, because nobody really knows what the token is worth at the onset. It'll be revealed over time as the network effects become clear. A property, a building like the ferry building, for example, will have a very clear cap in the market. But it's an interesting point. When a REIT gets sold, the pricing of a REIT is a very subtle measure, and people get down to the basis points, kind of the cap rate that applies the valuation. We don't really have methodologies right now to help develop pricing and price discovery for income-producing assets in the tokenized world, and simply jumping from what works for a utility coin into the token, into an income-producing property that has a real-world NAV is a really, really important distinction. And we can spend the rest of the day talking about that, but I just urge folks to really think a lot about that. And there's a whole industry of investment bankers that price real estate securities, and that's an important service.
There is a growing industry of token valuation firms too, as you probably know.
Indeed, but are they real estate experts? Yes.
Well, they have to be both.
Yes, they will need to be, of course. I'm just saying right now that those skill sets, I think, really don't overlap. It might not have been perhaps yourself. The number of people, the Venn diagram of people highly expert in pricing real estate securities and knowing a lot about the blockchain and tokenization, because my experience is over here, just one of the leading firms in REITs, and I know everybody.
Yeah,
it's not a lot. So this is great. It's a great business opportunity for those who are interested. I do believe this is a growing area, and I absolutely, commend you.
You're probably familiar with some of the valuation firms. There's a bunch. I just got done off the phone yesterday with a group out of Silicon Valley. Very impressive.
Yeah, so you're right. There are very few, and in fact, coming up with a value for a utility token. I mean, initially when it sells, it's highly speculative. You're anticipating what the value will be when a network is built, and it is nearly impossible to understand that, right? Like, what if we had a token for email protocol when it was first released, right? You would probably look to them and like, have two people can only use it, that, it's worthless, right? But today, of course, that would be a tremendously valuable utility token. So speculating on what the value is a really hard thing to do. And yes, the market is going to set a price for it by the end of the ICO, and then it's going to go way up, and then it's going to go way down, and there's really no basis or foundation in reality. There's just it's pure speculation. But in terms of what I look for when I filter, is first off, the team. Yes, it's absolutely incredibly important. Does the story make sense? Does their background, is their background such that they have a high likelihood of achieving this, or are they pivoting into something new? Who are the advisors? What is the size of the addressable market? Is the timing right? Or do more people need cryptocurrency in order for this to be interesting? And then from there, I really try to understand what the token represents, right? Is this a security? Okay, that's fine. They're doing traditional private placement. That's great. Or if there's a utility token, is the value of the network going to be reflected in this token? Or is there going to be slippage of value that's going to go elsewhere? And really trying to understand how the token will work, why it'll work, and why you need a token. These are the questions that I asked before attempting a project.
I think besides, you guys talked about what does a token do? Does it make sense? Is it innovative? Is it the next email protocol? I think the team is underemphasized. As I look at these ICOs that have come out, and I look at the team and I see it's 3 finance guys, 2 marketing guys, and an engineer. And this is not the one, this is like a lot of these. So I just think it's very easy. You just say, is one of the co-founders a real estate operator or investor? The answer is no, just get me away from this. You look at the balance of marketing guys too. So this is my opinion, and maybe next question for you, Jerry, is what should be a good team? What makes sense in terms of their background and the balance of people?
On the earlier panel, there was a gentleman sitting in this seat actually, who said, I don't understand why people think they need ICOs, because if you got a good management team, you can raise all that you want. And that is actually true, because, the reason why I left Prex and Logs, I didn't like the episodic nature of it, right? And you weren't invested in the long term. So I went to founding and growing businesses. Only once you're someone that's grown a business from nothing to a lot, you realize the mistakes that you can make early on that guarantee failure later, or that enhance success later. So, to me, a team that has the right pieces, if it's a real estate enterprise, competent, experienced real estate person in that space, multifamily, whatever, and the pieces around that reflect a real business that can grow, that can anticipate the issues that are going to come down the road and optimize the dynamics for success, and not embed minefields up front, which almost every ICO I've ever seen does.
Absolutely.
I just want to comment with the utility tokens. So
could you put your microphone a little closer? I think it's hard to hear. Okay.
So we are right now trying to implement also utility tokens. So just to give an example, the tokens is a membership token. it will enable the token holders if hold certain amount of tokens to access to a co-working space. So with this model, we can calculate how much is access to co-working space cost in the downtown in city, and that's one example how we value. We can give a price gap of the token valuation.
Let's actually go to questions now, and then we can always come back to the panel. So we got 2 microphones, so wherever you guys want to pick, we got some over on that side. So we'll go back and forth. And if you can, address it to one person, or you could say it to the whole panel. Yeah.
Let's see. I'm going to pick here. Patrick. Would it be a fair question to ask you your win-loss ratio, success, failure rate so far for ICOs?
That would be a fair question. So success is subjective, and ultimately the entrepreneur is going to define what success is. A company could raise 25 million and say, it was a failure, we were going for 100. Or a company could raise 5 and say, yeah, we did fantastic. I can tell you that in terms of the very first ICO that we did not hit the minimum. The minimum was $1 million. There was no PR, there was no marketing. They raised 200,000 based on a Bitcoin talk thread announcement, which isn't bad. Lesson learned on that. So we have had a string of successes. You know, Proppy raising 15 million, Polybius raising 32 million, Task Fund raising 8 million. You know, so there certainly are a lot of projects out there that flop, and I'm sure that we'll end up picking up some more of those. But so far, we're batting a pretty good average.
All right. Next question. How about anyone from this side? This is the dominant side.
Yeah, but for Patrick, I had a related question. If you could, maybe if you're able to talk about the highlights and the lowlights of that Proppy ICO, and how the landscape may be different today than when you started just a few months ago.
So I'll start with the second part as far as how it's different today than it was a few months ago. I think there's probably 100 or 150 ICOs going on at any given time. When we started the process with Proppy, there was maybe 15 or 25 active ICOs that were ongoing. So the volume and the quantity has just absolutely skyrocketed. I don't know that the quality has gone up as much, but the quantity surely has. In terms of the highlights, 15 million raised. That's definitely the highlight. Not only that, I would also highlight the thousands of participants who came into the project, right? These are people who are now going to be essentially have the potential to be prosumers, right? This is one of the, you mentioned something about if you have a good management team, you don't need to do an ICO. Sure, you can raise money if you have a really good management team and a good idea. What you're not going to get is that you're not going to get tens of thousands of people who will be consumers or who will be users of that platform to then be owners of it and have a sense of ownership. And that can't be replaced with VC money. Low lights, it's a stressful process. You know, a lot of things go wrong. The trolls come out, they throw a lot of mud online. You got a lot of problems to deal with. It's, you know, it's success or it's sink or swim, and it can be a very stressful process.
Don't get me wrong, I didn't say you shouldn't do an ICO. I was just saying the blind spot that person had is he's been involved with strong management teams, so he doesn't own the value of an ICO. He doesn't really see it, and I actually think supplementing a strong management team with a blend of traditional capital and tokenization and token-oriented participation in the capital raising is the optimal dynamic. So I didn't mean to lead that direction.
Let's go to this side.
Question for Patrick. If you could comment on a utility token, ICO, what type of initial capital requirements might be for those that might have a concept that want to work with a company such as yours to bring it to market?
That's a great question. So we have two different options, one of which is technology only, where we will write the smart contract, we'll list it on order book, we'll give you a token sales wizard and an investor or participant account. So providing all the technology as well as an escrow function for the tokens themselves. For that, we charge $20,000 up front, 2% of the total amount raised, and 2% of the tokens. If we're going to be doing full service, and this is a more accurate answer to your question, you can expect to spend several $100,000. The vast majority on that, on either attorneys and PR and marketing. There are a lot of ICOs ongoing, so unless you have an extremely strong network of whales that you can reach out to, you're going to have to do mass market in order to get the project out there. So a few $100,000 for PR, marketing, legal, technology, all the different pieces. Plus, for that option, we take 4% of the total amount raised and 4% of the tokens.
So maybe Ragnar, just
Yeah.
quickly comment on that, because there is a lot of marketing that goes on. This is an area where people need to be extremely careful. When you're selling a software product, you market the software product. That's not unreasonable. But it's how you market the software product. And you mentioned whales. Large token purchases are out there. Just let me say, you need to be extremely, extremely thoughtful. If you start to get something to look like a duck and quack like a duck, people are going to come around and say, you just made a duck, my friend. So be very, very, very careful in how you market a token that's meant to be a software product. And if I may, so my personal rule on this front, some of you may know the term WWJD. What would Jesus do? When you're selling a token, ask yourself WWMD. What would Microsoft do? If this is not something a seller of software would be out there doing, put a big question mark around what you're doing.
What would Microsoft do? You could sell armbands.
It's like, I'm selling them. It's a
That's how Greg can raise money.
Go on the website, download.
Yeah.
Take a
Well,
look.
in terms of like the marketing costs, something we've thought about at Ibrea is we've been approached by a lot of ICOs who want to do a meetup, and it's conflicting because there's good ones and bad ones, and I want the good ones to be able to share their progress, and I don't want to taint us with the bad ones. And so something we're thinking about doing is how do we deal with that? So if you guys have feedback, tell us about it, because we do want to enable progress, and we want to lower the cost for good projects. People spend way too much on lawyers, no offense, on marketing, no offense, and here's a good network, right, of people who are probably pretty smart, probably know real estate, but we don't want to present to these people, these good people, bad things. So we can talk about that later. But anyways.
By the way, it's not just lawyer consultants. Is it Friedman, the firm that was just here, right? So I have deep relationships at Deloitte. Deloitte has been a thought leader in this space. To get a full-blown, highly advantaged consulting that advantages the tax implications of issuing tokens, advantages how you use gap financing to account for the proceeds you receive, structuring in a global way. That's a $500 million minimum fee to Deloitte. Now, I think Friedman is more like a 50 to a 200. So it's not just the lawyers, by the way. That if you're going to really do a highly optimized dynamic, now you're going to love to spend that money 4 years from now. But you might not be able to get to 4 years from now if you have to spend the money. It's just a tough call.
Tax and accounting. Let's go to another question. Are we on this side or back to that side? Where did we leave off? Who asked the last question? Okay, so we go to this side. Anyone on this side?
I was going to ask about whether the type of investors are changing or have changed over the past year, from individuals to sort of formal fund organizations. And if you're trying to market a token and you're calling the token a security, do you have to be concerned if companies are investing in that token that generally invest for profit as opposed to, bigger concerns about sort of improving the ecosystem, things like that? Does that make sense?
I think it's a really good question, and you are seeing investment in tokens becoming institutionalized. Not like putting it into an institution, but you're having institutions that are now running funds that invest both in ICOs and in existing tokens, and they run into a whole other set of regulations. There's something called the 40 Act in the United States. If there's an offering right now, ICO, for something called Protos. And in order to avoid the 40 Act, they have to limit their U.S. investors to fewer than 100. But you get a whole different dynamic. I think it professionalizes the space a little bit. But yeah, you are seeing it become something where there's investment dynamics of a more institutional nature coming into the space.
And now T0, if you guys know Overstock.com, they have the only licensed regulated exchange that can list tokens that are securities. Token securities. So
it's a very interesting development right now.
yeah. So something to think about. Let's go to go to that side.
All right. So trying to bring it back to real estate. Gerald, you made a very important distinction between the process of transferring a title and transferring ownership over an SPV. Because the corporate SPV, you said, carries the liability that may have been incurred while operating the asset to the next owner. I think it's a very important point that a lot of people that are looking to tokenize real estate assets miss out on. Could you state a few specific examples of how this type of liability has been a problem for owners?
Well, so one of the things that I think that people who are very focused on the tokenized dynamic fail to consider is where do I fit in traditional financial dynamics, right? The fact of the matter is that if you make a commitment to an ICO dynamic, that may preclude access later to traditional investment, because if it should come down, and some of these offerings are more problematic than we thought because regulators take stronger stances, you're never going to get a regular traditional lender or equity investors to invest in that kind of risk dynamic. Same thing with real estate, right? The traditional real estate lenders like to see a nice, pristine acquisition, and then you're going to get an advantage loan where it might not be, what's it called, when it can go back to the owner? Non-recourse, where it might be a non-recourse, but if you have unknowable risk around prior operations, you might not get that kind of advantage loan dynamic, participate in what is later rolled up into a CMBS environment. That's a perfect example of why.
Yeah, Chad, I just second that because it's a great point. The lenders, particularly lenders going into commercial mortgage-backed securities or CMBS, are very sensitive about who their equity is and knowing who their equity players are, and having a diversified pool that could shift around potentially, can cause a lot of concern if you're going to lever, the real estate. It hasn't come up, but most real estate properties out there are levered, and so ignoring the bank community, the finance community, this dialogue is you do that at your own risk because they're going to be an important stakeholder.
On the other hand, a collection of real estate assets, as we see in REITs, can be on the other side attractive. Now instead you have lenders who will lend on an entity basis, which actually tends to be cheaper, and they have a bunch of assets that they're running in an illustrative way with transparency into their operations through SEC reports. I've had multi-million-dollar REITs that I've run at Capital, and that's actually a goal, to get beyond having to do single asset financing to take it up to the higher level. So it's circumstantial how it may play out in a particular place, but certainly a blockchain dynamic could end up replacing traditional REITs.
Last thing, don't forget your AML and sanctions and KYC need that point, because if you're doing a token sale and you have a nexus with the U.S., you better be darn sure you're not violating any of those things. So,
Yeah,
go ahead.
and people, Singapore is a hot spot, Switzerland. Patrick, if you're an American citizen, why would you go to Singapore or Switzerland? Is there a reason to do that? Does he have an advantage in Singapore over other people? So my question is, does it matter where you are?
Sure, it does matter where you are. Well, there's two questions. One is where you're incorporated and then who you're selling to, right? So if you're incorporated in Singapore and you're selling to U.S. persons, you still have to obey U.S. law. Now, there may be different corporate laws that are more favorable in Singapore or Switzerland, maybe favorable tax jurisdictions in the Cayman Islands, right? These are all things to take into considerations and talk to your lawyer about. But you ultimately are going to be, if you're selling into a certain jurisdiction, you've got to play by their rules.
Okay, let's do another question. Is it this side? I'm dyslexic, I think. Go ahead.
Jerry, I'm sorry.
Oh,
That side?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jerry, you mentioned that there's some landmines that ICOs that you see a lot. Could you expand on that a little bit? What are some key mistakes?
Well, so I don't believe in complying with the law for compliance sake, right? Otherwise, I would never speak. I believe and one thing that's clear for building companies, I believe in looking at compliance and understanding the consequences of the ability to comply or the wish to comply and how that's all going to come down. So I have kind of developed a model for a very pristine token environment, which is going to protect you. But whether you can afford to do that is another question. Both afford to from the point of view of whether the capital can be raised and the cost of doing it, right? So the fact is that I am one of the more, having gone through the life cycle of several businesses, very intricately, I am one of the more skeptical token sales guys. Because I've gone through ups and downs, and I have never had a successful civil lawsuit or a hint of a criminal lawsuit in anything that I've done. And by the way, in the last depression, very few people went to jail because it was in very clearly understood regulatory and systemic environment so they could protect themselves. The ICO environment is so unknowable as to the consequences of what you're doing in it. When the next crash hits and people want heads on pikes, I'm very fearful for ICO.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point is, startups fail. It's not exclusive to ICOs or blockchain or real estate, but startups fail. Now, when most startups fail, the VCs are out of money. We don't feel that sorry for them. But when these ICOs fail, and they will, those aren't VCs who can take that hit. And what happens when the mob comes after you when your startup fails?
I'm involved in something called the Cyber Future Foundation, which is all about how do we make what is becoming a more and more, it's funny, the internet itself is becoming more and more Wild West because the opportunities for anonymity and behavior and the consequences of crimes on the internet is so low. I saw some statistic where the UK is looking at something like 10,000 cyber crimes and has prosecuted less than 200. Right? That's, from a risk-benefit perspective, we should all be cyber criminals. Right? I mean, that is.
IBRA doesn't endorse that statement.
Yeah, that's right.
That's purely your.
That's even less risky than doing ICOs. I mean, you're never going to get caught. So at the end of the day, I ask the people that I consult and consider my business, do you really want anonymous investors? Look at how anonymity works on the internet. You're free to be a criminal, pretty much, right? So if you're taking in anonymous investors, and let's say you raise 50 million bucks overnight. How many of those think that the way to deal with failure is to shoot the people who caused the failure? Well, how do you know? They're anonymous. And then when you open the door, I've had businesses that fail, not many, fortunately. I never really worry that if I open the door, there'd be one of my investors there with a gun shooting me in the chest.
Dramatic, but true.
Getting a little heavy here, Ragnar, but
I have my concealed carry for that.
some Kevlar. Yeah, just some quick observations. I think one of the things that this discussion is doing is eliding back and forth between utility tokens and security tokens. And Jerry, the point you made about assuming you're actually having investors because you're selling a security, for example, real estate-backed security, well taken points, and knowing who your investors are and who you relate to. Some of that is very different when you have a different kind of model, a utility model, which could involve real estate potentially. We're not saying it could not. And in that case, when Microsoft sells a product, again, coming back to my WWFD, they don't necessarily know who's buying Word online. They don't, they're not an investor. They're not a voter in how Microsoft. They're not a stakeholder other than they're a product purchaser. So I think it is important. This is a very subtle, complex area, and just make sure you're working through what you're talking about, because we're, here on stage, we're talking about a bunch of different things at the same time. They're all correct, but they might not apply in every case. So I just want to.
So we just have like 3 minutes. So let's do another question. I think on this side there was.
think another issue I haven't heard you guys talk about, but I think is a sort of a structural challenge with ICOs, and that is, these companies are selling tens of millions of tokens in these ICOs at prices that sometimes are many dollars per token, and so the market cap of these companies at ICO is astronomical compared to what a venture capitalist might market them at, given the state of their businesses. So consequently, what we're seeing is a lot of ICO prices, or token prices, once the tokens get on the exchanges, is people are just getting out of them like crazy, and the prices are crashing. So from the standpoint of ICO planning, for AmbiSafe, do you have when you structure these ICOs, do you have a plan to try and make sure that doesn't happen? You have a bunch of unhappy token holders the week after the sale.
So the value of the token itself is based on, assuming that we're talking about a utility token, is based on what the future value of that network will be. And anybody who if you participate in an ICO, then if you're looking to speculate and flip it quickly, then good luck to you. I have no protections for you. I have no way of helping you either achieve that or not achieve that. If you're looking to hold it because you believe in what the product will become, and you think that in 5 years' time this is going to be a really smart thing to put your money into, then who cares if it drops right after it goes out? And you say that these valuations are spectacularly high compared to what a VC would give, and I agree with that point. I think that we will look back at the valuations, which today we perceive to be spectacularly high, and say, wow, what a bargain it would have been to get in at that price. Because some of these, there will be a correction in this market. I think that the correction is probably further out than most people think, given the amount of money that's coming in, and we haven't really seen the institutional investors come in. Definitely not in a big way, but they will. And eventually there will be a correction, and a lot of these tokens are going to go all the way down. Another point is that I don't necessarily think that if a project fails, a token will go to zero, because it's not equity. It's a tradable instrument. And you can go back to, go to Rome and pick up currency from 800 years ago that you can't buy anything with it, but the value of it is not zero. And there's plenty of tokens and currencies out there that are trading that have spectacular valuations, and they have absolutely no underlying utility or intrinsic value whatsoever, but they're still trading very high. So that'll be an interesting thing to see. So in terms of our goal is to maximize the total amount that our client will be raising. And so we have different mechanisms for modeling that out. We work with professional auctioneers and these types of things to do that. I know it's not exactly the answer that you wanted, but...
So by the way, the one dynamic where you're allowed to inhibit the market, traditional securities business, is when you're offering securities. The underwriters are allowed to make a certain amount of the market. Generally, you see underwriters try to price IPOs about 20% below the market because they want the kind of thing that this gentleman expressed, that want a market that is got kind of a stability, a reliability for investors who can go into the market again and again. A really interesting question, if these are ICOs, to the extent to which AmbiSafe, don't get worried, is market manipulation dynamics.
Yeah.
One last question, and we gotta, yeah.
Quick thought on that, because there's a lot of discussion.
It's not.
There's a lot of discussion in the market about something called a SAP, which is the Simple Agreement for Future Tokens. This is a very controversial suggestion. It's basically put forward by one interest group, and there are a lot of folks out there with strong disagreements with the viability or even benefits of that approach. I would say, Ragnar, that one of the biggest risks is actually endorsing a SAF type approach where you bring in venture funds and investors in an early round at an extremely discounted price, 50% off, 80% off, or 90% off in some cases. When you do the main sale of the tokens, you have most folks coming in and you have all your venture funds exiting out, and that creates exactly the downward pressure. So I would strongly encourage people considering a token sale to look very closely, try and avoid a structure that incentivizes wrong behavior, and get to your main sale as quickly as possible. Do as much work on your platform, and then so you don't have that crosswind that really I think is very, very dangerous.
Good point. Gotta look at the incentives.
Before we close, since I can say this to everybody one time, my mantra is that as far as blockchain, we're 1990s internet, and as far as tokens, we're 1890s equities. And I would encourage you to pick up a book. You can get it for $1 on Alibree or Alipress.com. These books are called The Scarlet Woman of Wall Street, about the Erie Railroad wars between Vanderbilt and all those guys, where they had really corrupt and ineffective exchanges, and they played with the stock of the railroad, which was the first equities that traded. And you will see incredible parallels between now and then. And so, as far as the whole dynamic, that can't be more informative than anything you could.
Yeah, as it says in Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. One last question from this side. So Kelly, if you want to.
It relates to proof of compliance. So it seems like the golden ticket, or the question that doesn't seem to be answered very effectively, is if someone's going to tokenize real estate and they want to comply, they go to the regulators, they get full compliance, what's the concern of the regulators that needs to be addressed? Is it just the anonymity of the source of the funds? Like they get an exempt market status, for example, and now they're fully compliant, they can issue tokens in real estate, and they have to go to accredited investors. What other concerns are we missing here that we're not talking about that the regulators are?
Before Lewis answers that substantively, as the businessman, I want to tell you one of the most frustrating things in the world is doing a business that complies while you see everybody around you not. And you realize that the guy who tries to comply is the most vulnerable to regulators because you're very open. It's really frustrating. But I'll let Lewis talk to himself.
That's fair enough. I think the number one rule once you have a security is disclosure and transparency. And the good news about real estate is we have 50 years of public real estate securities to look to with nuanced answers to almost any question you might possibly have in terms of how do we ensure disclosure and transparency to investors. So the SEC has answers to almost any question. So I think if you're selling a real estate-backed security and it happens to be in tokenized form, I wouldn't stress. You go to people who know that market and be transparent about what you're doing and add value to a traditional security.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great panel, great questions from everyone, but we got to end, so let's give a round of applause.